So what I'm going to talk about is a bunch of different things. And I want to talk about 3 shifting cultures. If you've been paying attention to what's happening at this conference or any other conference for the last little while, you know that there's a shift in the culture of the classroom from a culture of compliance to a culture of care, because there's nothing that we can't do with kids when they feel that they're cared about. There's also a shift in culture in our kids' lives. We grew up with lives that were private by default, public with effort, but that's flipped for the kids, right? The kids are growing up more and more in these public spaces, living their lives publicly, and being private is something that you do with effort. And of course, there's also this other cultural shift that's happening across our entire society. We're moving from a consumer culture to a participatory culture, a culture where we expect not just to take in information, but we also want to participate in it. So when I was thinking about this keynote, and I knew I was going to say something about that, how am I going to participate with 900, 1,000 people? So here's the idea. One of the themes that's coming up in the conference again and again is how do we share our stories? And what does a digital storyteller look like? So here's an example of what a digital story, you should grab that picture now, of what a digital storyteller looks like. So I'm actually going to invite a friend of mine, Sherry, if you don't mind coming up on stage. I've got this little frame, and what I'm going to ask you to do, I've got a Sharpie here, and I'm going to write a little message on my hand. And I'm going to pass the Sharpie around. It's not writing on my hand because I'm nervous and there's too much. So I'm out of luck with that. But if you just take a picture of me, got it. On the back, there's an email address. I'm going to give that to Sherry. She's going to email that picture off, and then she's going to get someone to do the same for her, and that's going to get passed around the audience. I don't need that back till, after lunch Friday. Is that okay? And if you want to participate, if you don't want to see your face on the internet, because that's where the pictures are going to be, we're going to collect all those pictures together, and it's going to become a video to remember what does a digital storyteller look like. Well, that's you, the person to your left and right. If you don't want to put your face on the internet, you can write your message on your hand and take a picture of that, okay? So back to the tales of learning and the gifts of footprints, which is how I've titled this talk. And I've packed a lot in it, so I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly. And I want to talk specifically about 3 things. What are the changing literacies of learning in an increasingly technophilic society? And I just realized, yeah, and we're all good. And I'm tweeting as I'm talking. You should be seeing the tweets, giving you some more layered conversation to links that you can explore in more depth. I also want to talk about footprints. And usually people use an image of footprints in the sand, but I use a footprint in concrete because there's this notion of what we call the digital now, where time now, when you search for someone, it includes all the time that they've left stuff online, and the past and the present kind of blend together into one thing. And that has consequences for how we teach and how we live and how we learn. I also want to talk about gifts. I want to finish maybe by sharing some gifts with you and talk about some gifts that you may be able to share afterwards. So what are these literacies, these digital learning literacies? I think there's, in education, we've done a pretty good job with when we classically define literacy as the ability to read and write. But if our kids only learn to read and write, they won't be literate. And so our understanding of literacy has evolved and expanded to include things like numeracy, being able to understand the world through the lens of numbers and how information is shared with us numerically and making sense of that. But over time, that's shifted more and more. And at the advent of the printing press, it's not the case that we had old world plus printing press. When the printing press came along, there were all kinds of new jobs that never existed before: publisher, author, writer, bookseller. When the internet came along, that all changed again. And Neil Postman says that a new medium doesn't add anything, it changes everything. So it's not the case that we have old world plus internet, we have an entirely different world. If you drop one drop of red food color into a glass of water, you can't separate it out again. And that's kind of what's happened in our society and our culture. So what impact has this had on teaching and learning today? What are the 3 basic literacies that this implies that we need to focus on in our classes? It's really a question of scale, because there was a time where the influence that a person could have was limited by the distance that they could walk in a day. But scale today has changed everything. You can, with a tweet or one blog post, have an impact that goes global almost instantaneously. So those 3 literacies of digital learning, or 3 literacies that I think we need to increasingly focus on, are this. The first is that critical consumers of media, and we live in an increasingly technophilic society and increasingly media-rich society. A critical consumer of media needs to also be a creator of media. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. At the time of the BP oil spill, this was the picture that was on the front page of the BP website as they were working to try to correct the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. One blogger visited that site and he looks at this picture. Look at it carefully. Is there something wrong with the picture? Because one blogger visited the site and looked at this image and said, there's something not right there. I'll show you where. In all of these places, there's light bleeding through in the image that really shouldn't be there. And if you've never worked with digital imagery before, you may not recognize it, because the real image behind them was this one. And BP did not want to put blank screens on the front page of their website, so they did actually a really bad Photoshop job. This was reported in the Washington Post. That story went viral, and it was a disaster for BP. And we need to know, not only when people are telling us the truth with media, but we need to know when they're lying to us with media. And that comes from being able to create content with media. Another thing that you hear again and again is engagement. That everything we're doing is really focused on engagement. And I'm going to steal a line from my friend Chris Lehman, who's in the audience. It's not about engagement. Engagement is not an end. Engagement is a means to the end of student empowerment, which you heard Shannon talk about a little bit, and I'm going to give you another example. There was this young lady who, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, she started a blog by taking pictures of what she ate for lunch. A little Irish girl, 9 years old. And she would take a picture of what she ate for lunch, and she would put the picture on a blog, and she said, this is what I had. And she had the foodometer, how good it was, how many mouthfuls, what the courses were, health rating, the price, and of course the all-important statistic, pieces of hair. For whatever reason, this blog goes viral, and other kids around the world start sending her pictures of their lunch, like this little boy from Taiwan. And I mean, if you look at his lunch compared to what she was eating earlier, right? It has nothing like it. And so it started to look really bad for the school district where she went to school. So she started blogging like late April, early May, and June 14th, she's called into the principal's office. And she's told, you can no longer blog about your lunch. And so June 14th, her blog is shut down. The story, when she posts that on her blog, she's got a following across the world. The story goes viral, gets picked up by the mainstream media. She gets over 2,000 comments on her own blog, but more on blogs and Facebook and all across the world. June 15th, her blog is reinstated because even the Minister of Education in Scotland, responding from a tweet by someone enraged by what had happened, said, we have to fix this. That's what we mean by student empowerment. All she did was start with something that was of interest to her, and it went global. And who could predict that? So if you're a kid, if you're 9 years old and you have the world looking at you, what do you do with that? Well, what she did was she put a little widget on the side of her blog and inviting people to make donations to an organization called Mary's Meals, which feeds starving provides food for small villages in Malawi. Her goal was to raise 7,000 British pounds. She exceeds her goal by over 1,800%. In US dollars, it's over $250,000 that she raises in this way. That's what we mean by student empowerment. The third thing that we often talk about, the fundamental change or literacy that we need to learn about is, 21st century learning often held in contrast to 20th century learning. We think 20th century learning, everybody had to learn to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. We're really preparing people for the factories, right? And then we often talk about 21st century learning. Well, maybe it's not the 21st century, maybe it's the collaborative century. Because that's the literacy of working with different people at different times and different ways to do different things is actually a fundamental skill that all of our kids need to learn, and so do we. It's the first time in the history of education that we're preparing kids for a future that's uncertain. The near future you can kind of see, but the distant future you can't. For example, today, some of the hottest jobs available today are things like data miner, data visualizer, jobs that just didn't exist 5 years ago. And you've got kids in your classes, you're preparing them for jobs that simply, we have no idea what that's going to look like. But there's good news too, because it turns out that the best way to learn something is to teach it. I don't need to tell a room full of teachers that. But we need to, if that's a deep learning experience for you, then we need to pass that learning experience on to our kids. And we need to find ways for our kids to become the teachers, to make contributions to the global knowledge commons. What they're learning from you in your classrooms should not stay in your classrooms, because if it stays there, in time it withers. But if it can get out of your classroom in some way, then it has wings and it grows and bears fruit. At the time of the one-room schoolhouse, kids had to go to that place at that time to talk to that person, because all the knowledge that we were learning was in the books, and you needed someone to help you decode it and understand it. And we understood at that time that knowledge was a noun. It was a thing that you had to learn and accumulate. That's shifting now. Knowledge is no longer a noun. We think of knowledge as a verb, something that we co-construct. Look, for example, at Wikipedia. Right now, it's being edited in real time. And I just tweeted a link to this visualization. And if you follow the link to that visualization, what you'll see is in real time, as Wikipedia is being edited, you'll see bubbles appear on the screen. The white bubbles are edits by anonymous users. The green bubbles are edits by Wikipedians. The purple bubbles are edits by bots. The size of the bubble indicates the size of the edit. You'll also hear music. You'll hear the sound of a bell every time someone deletes something from Wikipedia, and you'll hear strings every time someone adds something. And the depth will tell you the size of that edit as well. And you'll also hear a big swelling in the music every time someone new joins Wikipedia. And if you've been looking at the visualization just in the short time that I've been talking, that's happened several times already. It's a fast, and scroll down the page and look how it's available in 50+ different languages. The English Wikipedia is not the whole story. Because the question we need to ask ourselves, as Seth Godin says, is, are we teaching kids to collect dots or to connect dots? And what I mean by that is, like, you're not just looking at a collection of dots on the screen. If I take the image you're looking at and turn it, what you're really looking at is a view from the International Space Station of Europe. You can see England top left. That bright spot is London. And then Paris, you can see, is the next bright spot bottom right. So pattern recognition is one of the things that we fundamentally need kids to learn. People often say that mathematics is kids learning computation skills and how to figure stuff out. That's not what mathematics is. It's pattern recognition. But we're all involved in teaching pattern recognition. This is attributed to Dewey. If we teach today as we taught yesterday, then we rob our children of tomorrow, which is, I thought, a very pertinent quote. And this one often attributed to Alvin Toffler, but actually the psychologist Herbert Gurjoy: tomorrow's illiterate won't be those who can't read. It will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So those are some of the literacies. That's the context that we're working in. I want to talk a little bit about footprints. And what do I mean by footprints? So you've got today kids using stuff like Snapchat, right? And I am not in favor of coming down heavy and hard on kids for doing bad things with tools. And you look at Snapchat, for those of you that don't know what it is, you take a picture, you send it to someone, and you set it with a time limit from 1 to 10 seconds, and the picture's supposed to self-destruct. The person who receives the picture actually could take a screen capture, but then Snapchat lets you know that that happened. Mind you, so what? They still have the picture you didn't want them to have. And the pictures are not actually private, because there's these other apps like Snap Hack. And if you download Snap Hack to your phone, with Snap Hack, what you can do is any picture that you've received or sent with Snapchat, you can mark it, you can save it to your camera roll, forward to friends, send by email, post to Twitter or Facebook. Nothing on the internet is private. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not necessarily advocating for or against Snapchat, because if you watch how kids use Snapchat, when they receive a snap, they know it's going to disappear, and so they choose not to look at it right now, because they want to pay attention to it when they're looking to it. And the subtext of the way kids use Snapchat is it's about attention. They are focused on that content, whatever it is. So if you want their attention, there may be something there to think about. Mind you, a couple just at the beginning of this year, over the winter holiday, Snapchat was hacked. They didn't have very good security, and over 4.6 million usernames and their telephone numbers were published. And they actually made a website where you could see if your name and telephone number was published. Now, if you look at this, it looks like the website has gone offline. That's not because the internet is down. But if I head over to a website called archive.org, right in the center of the website, there's something called the Wayback Machine. And if I paste that URL into there, I can see that this website first came online live in 2014, actually in January. And each of these blue dots is showing me when the site was updated. So if I wanted to see the site as it looked at 5:53 and 38 seconds on January 14th, 2014, all I have to do is click that link, and then it loads the page as it looked like. Remember, this page doesn't exist online anymore, but here it is in the Internet Archive. Now, that's what the page looks like, and you'll notice that I can download the file. And now I'm not actually going to download the file, but there's the file. I could get the file offline. So these are some of the things that kids need to be aware of, that the stuff that they're sharing has lasting permanence. It doesn't mean you shouldn't share. It means you should share thoughtfully. Twitter, and I was talking about this yesterday in one of my sessions, Twitter is often seen as a place where kids get bullied and harassed a lot, where kids get called down. In one school, kids were getting bullied or harassed, basically torn down on Twitter, and one kid in the school thought that was wrong. So what he did was he created an anonymous Twitter account, and the name of his high school was Aseo High School, and he created an account called Aseo Nice Things. And what he did was, in his Twitter account, all the kids that were being torn down, this kid started building back up again and started tweeting anonymously. So the account gets very popular in the school. And, you know, the story of Aseo Nice Things went viral, it went into mainstream media. And down here on the bottom, I don't know if you can see that, it says, how many people have an account similar to the Dalai Lama? Right? Like, but the idea goes viral, so kids in other schools, Minnetonka Nice, Chanhassen Nice, Chaska Nice, start copying it. This is a group of kids. By the way, when he graduated, he got into grade 12, he graduated, and then he passed the account to a kid in grade 9. So there's a grade 9 kid who is remaining anonymous. I know because I've communicated with them back and forth on Twitter a few times. They're staying anonymous. When that kid gets to grade 12, I'm going to pass it back again. And so it's a virtue. Now understand what happened there. No adult said to any kid at any time, thou shalt. So this group of kids did it as a group, and they build West High Bros. And when I went to look at their site, it's kind of just another example of the same thing. This tweet really struck me, and I'll pull it out so you can see what I'm talking about. Because the first kid, Rod White, is not one of those kids in that school. He says, I sent compliments to others. I follow no acknowledgement yet, but not important. It's the thought that counts, right? West High Bros answers, right, keep doing what you're doing. Believe it or not, it makes a huge difference every word. Now understand what's going on here. These kids don't know each other. These kids could be in vastly different locations. And because of the actions of one kid, they've inspired another kid to do something in their own community. Because when the good stuff that kids do is shared, it has wings and it can spread. This kid, turns out she really likes writing, so she self-publishes on Amazon. Because she's doing it herself, she gets 70% of the profit. Age 26, she's a millionaire. This kid didn't even know he likes to write. A middle school kid who wrote a short story for his teacher. His teacher says, hey, that's a good story. I'll help you develop it. They work on it all year, and now he's self-published on Amazon. And he's just in middle school. This kid likes to play music and put it online. And what she does, she plays this song from Lady Gaga and puts it online. Lady Gaga sees the song, and then what she does is she says, this is amazing. She invites the kid, her whole family, puts them up in hotel in Toronto, pays for their entire weekend, and has this young lady come sing with her on stage because she chooses to share her passion on YouTube. Now, I know YouTube is blocked in a lot of schools, and I know filtering is an issue, and I am not against internet filters. I think there's a place for internet filters in our schools. But, like my friend David Weiss says, I think we need to move. It's not that I'm against internet filters, but I want to move the filter out of the router and into the kids' heads. Because if you think about it, the filters, the only people that are being stopped by the filters are us. The kids always get around it. And the reason for this, of course, is that educating is always, always more powerful than blocking. And when we talk about citizenship, because a lot of these issues come up when we talk about digital citizenship, but digital citizenship is not ethics. Ethics is part of it, but that's not the whole story. Because when we're teaching kids about digital citizenship, we've got to go beyond telling them what not to do. It's not that you shouldn't do this, but you should also be in favor of something. You should also make some kind of positive contribution. Citizenship is the combination of acting ethically and making a positive contribution. And I love the way Anne Frank sums it up, how wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. She had no idea of the power of that statement in the time of the internet. And lastly, I want to wrap this up with just a couple of gifts. So for me, how is it that 10 months can be greater than 10 years? When I started blogging with my classes back in 2005, the first 10 months that I was doing that with my kids, I learned more about teaching and learning and understanding what was going on with my kids than the entire 10 years previous to that, the entire lifetime to that point. And so what I started doing, if I asked my kids to share what they were learning, I decided that that was something that I had to do as well. And so what I started doing is I started making these little videos talking about, in this case, why I can't imagine teaching without a blog, but I started making these little videos to share what I was learning. I have these words from David Wiley knocking about in my head. If there's no sharing, there's no learning. Because if teachers ultimately are not sharers, think about that. If it's what you do is not sharing, then what is it that you're doing? Teaching is fundamentally a sharing activity. I have one teacher who I shared this activity. There's this author, Austin Kleon. Some of you may know him. He popularized this activity of blackout poetry. You take an article in the newspaper, black out all the words but some, and then those words form a poem. So when I shared this with an English teacher, a grade 12 English teacher, she went back to her class and she started doing it with her kids. She started taking pictures of what was going on in the classroom and sharing them on Instagram. And she had the wherewithal to tag the picture with Austin Kleon's username. So when she did that, he saw the pictures. Next day, Austin Kleon takes all the pictures she put on Instagram and publishes on her blog, and her kids now have audiences of thousands from all over the world just because this is teacher acting as connector. How do I join those kids? So this is her class blog. So one day I introduced this teacher to another teacher who lives in the far north of Manitoba. These teachers have never met, they'd never seen each other, and just kind of tweet-reduced them, right, on Twitter. They decide to collaborate. The grade 12 kids are teaching the grade 3 kids via Skype about punctuation, and they had to do it visually, and the kids in grade 12 learned deeply what it means to teach something and know it well. Well, the following week, the grade 3 kids taught the grade 12 kids about procedural writing. Like, how awesome is that, right? And when I was kind of sharing this story with the teachers and talking about them, talking to them about it, I kind of made the comment, like, that's what I love about what they're doing, how who's the teacher, who's the learner there. I call that network spaghetti. And you know, the other thing that I really like about that is it really, really demonstrates how Dylan Williams' 5 principles of active learning are illustrated in that story. I don't have time to go into that now, so you have to come to the follow-up to see that. But thinking about my own learning, selfishly, as a professional, I'd take the bus to work every day, and the walk from the bus stop to my front door is about 6 minutes. So in 6 minutes, I pull out my phone, and I use this little app called Social Cam, and I make a little video, and I record it while I'm walking, and then I'm not doing this for anybody but me. I'd push the video to YouTube, and then there it lives in a playlist. And really, it's just a way for me to remember the stuff that was happening to me or what I learned that day. But I do it in public. And it turns out that learning selfishly but publicly is an act of generosity, because what I've learned is that those little videos have been compelling to people in places that I never imagined they would be. And they've been used and reused in contexts that I never imagined or intended. But that's wonderful, because then people engage me in conversation and help me understand what I'm learning much better than I ever could have on my own. Now, I realize that's not for everybody. And it feels awkward, and sometimes I tell you, I push the button and I think that what I just recorded sucks. And I push the button anyway. Sometimes I think I got a good one. I push the button, publish it, and no one looks at it. Sometimes I push the button on something that sucks and everybody thinks it's wonderful. So these are the 3 things that I was talking about. I was talking about, so what are the literacies that we really need to think through that are changing as a result of the digital world interacting with the physical world? What about the footprints in the digital now, and how does that impact what we're sharing and how we share? And of course, the gifts that I'm talking about are these stories. right? The most important thing are the stories of learning that are coming out of our classroom. I shared with you some of mine. Take those stories. I've shared with you some other people's stories. Take those stories with you and engage in those conversations in your own districts and in your own communities. Because the one thing that I want you to take away from this little brief talk is to share. Share your tales of learning. Because there's no more powerful way to learn than by sharing our stories. Thanks.